You know what? Let's not have a countdown today.
Oh, now
And it's
I'm
not
confused.
and it's not because I misclicked. I promise. Okay? It has nothing to do with me having misclicked it. So everybody,
So we will have it
give a
next time when you don't misclick?
if I remember to misclick it, yes, then we'll
So,
not have it.
so what you're saying is that you never make mistakes. It was on purpose. That's
No, well, I could have made it worse by reacting to it too fast and having a different hotfix procedure than I would have normally. Everybody, give a
I have
warm
stopped the
welcome
stream
to.
once. That was way worse than missing
Oh, you mean you
countdown.
pressed this button?
Yeah, I wanted to leave and I just pressed end stream.
Everybody, give a warm welcome to Brian Finster joining us for the 6th time, I think. Now is it number 5?
Mm-hmm.
I lost count. We had a
I think he counts as
hot
moderator
join.
now.
Yeah, we had a hot join once. I'm not sure whether we're counting that one as a Brian stream or not. But Brian, you're very welcome as always. One of our regulars now on our tech journey.
I enjoy the conversations.
Well, we enjoy having you along for the conversations. So, what can you tell us about? We are here to discuss Crowdstrike and continuous delivery and trying to separate out noise from political legalese from good practical lessons or insights that we can take from this.
Well, I'm sure that nobody actually knows who CrowdStrike is, right? Because on the surface, there's not been a lot of news about it at all.
The incident is the first time that I was exposed to Crowdstrike as a company.
Me too.
So, Adrian, did you know Crowdstrike? Do you use it at your companies?
No, I never saw it. So I think this is the software with this black screen and the white smiley, isn't it? Oh,
what? No, but
it's the first time I saw it.
No, honestly, as soon as I started seeing things pop up, so a little bit about me. So I've been riding motorcycles since 2005, and I knew because when I started riding, a friend of mine gave me a copy of Proficient Motorcycling, which explained to me exactly how much more likely I was to get in a serious accident in a motorcycle, like the statistics. And so I came into it not with this, I'm going to go super fast point of view, but I want to ride a bike. I want to do it well, and I need to know where the risks are. And so read that book, and that book gave me a lot of insights that no motorcycle training I'd ever been to gave me. But also, I read every single crash report I could find. Every single time somebody, especially around where I live, because it's a lot of motorcycle riding around here, because we have wonderful roads. Don't move here. Anytime there was something in the paper, I would start trying to dig deeper and try to figure out exactly what were the conditions that caused that accident. Anytime I heard about anyone getting an accident, I would talk to people who knew what was going on and try to dig into what can I learn from this to become safer, right? Because I want to continue riding a motorcycle. Now, I don't know if it's correlation or causation. I've never been in a serious accident in the past 20 years. And it's not because I ride like a grandmother. But I approach incidents the same way. Production incidents like CrowdStrike the same way. The thing that I see all the time and have experienced. So we deploy something to production and it would break. And what's the next thing that happens? Manager comes and yells at you about why did you break things? I don't know. Why did you put me in a situation where things could break easily? Why are we living in such a fragile environment? What can we dig into this? No. Just go fix it and ship the next feature. Drives me crazy.
Or even the other way around. Like, why is the company at risk if I introduce one brake? Like, why is the risk factor to single brake ratio so high and sort of skewed towards my responsibility, not to the business plan or to the business analysis side?
I have deep experience with incident management, and it's not because I studied it. It's because I lived
there.
So And then, but we have these big outages that impact, large swaths of enterprises like Crowdstrike. I see the same pattern repeated over and over again. People chiming in about the simple things they should have done that I'm too smart to break that way because I do simple things that prevent that from happening. In this particular instance, I'm even seeing calls for prosecuting developers for making that change. And this shows a level of immaturity of thinking that drives me crazy. And so I'd like to talk about that. I also like to talk about, what your takeaways were. I've got some takeaways I'm writing down right now. I'm in the middle of finishing up a blog post, hopefully get published this week, to talk about the lessons learned for me, and what we can take away, but also understanding that this is security software that's running at the kernel level. This is not something that I do every day. I've had to do a lot of reading to figure out what it is the actual change was and trying to understand the engineering balances between how they were deploying.
And why the blue screens? I never deployed kernel software over the wire. Like that was a first to me. So I first had to check like what are the peculiarities of coding in Ring 0 and like what as a consequence would facilitate different software engineers. Like for example, if you talk to embedded software engineers, they have different constraints in mind when they're coding compared to somebody who's building a web application, right? So a kernel driver, so a piece of software that has full access to the system because it's masquerading as a sensor, as a kernel driver. It's called a sensor, but there's no sensor information. It just wants full access to memory.
Well, I've only deployed to Unix systems my entire career.
Yeah, and my background was primarily the Linux kernel, or at least the Unix kernel, not so much how it's working in Windows and what the peculiarities are. Now I know why certain processes are more prone to bloom screening than others.
Well, and I say that just to say that I'm not going to go and pontificate about how I'm such an expert at their engineering problem. But there are still things that all of us can learn from this.
Yeah. Like, I was disappointed to see the social media response on the first few days, because the primary, generally for incident reports, if you're a benevolent leader of your team, the last thing you want to do in this kind of incident is to look for blame. The last thing you want to do is to find a person to shoot.
Honestly, the expectation I had was Crowdstrike to be coming out with the name of the developer they fired.
I saw that desire of the community on social network to sort of rampantly building, like somebody, it's like a witch hunt. Whose fault was it? Yeah. And I hate when incident responses go that way, because the only thing you do if you act like that as a leader, as an organization, as a stakeholder, as a team member, is to incentivize the next time this happens, is to incentivize the cover-up of the incident.
Exactly. You break the entire engineering culture and working culture in that moment, because you lay the wrong foundation, because people will never forget what happens in that specific moment, because that's basically, for that company, it's a 9/11 moment, right? So they sit there and they see all this world breaking apart. Everyone comes down to a team. It's not a single developer in that moment. I don't believe in that. I think the entire team, or maybe the organization sitting there, is totally shocked by that. And the last thing you should do is find the responsible person. Like, everyone in the team probably knew, who was working in this particular team or in the teams above that, it could have something to do with me. I don't think that the specific person knew in that very moment, that was me, something like that. And this is what we should see here, because in the next, so we want to have that in the future as well, that we are, let's say, resilient to that as a team regarding, let's say, the morale of the team. So we should still be let's say, not afraid to deploy something, because continuous delivery is about confidence. And if you rip off confidence, you can't do that anymore.
Absolutely.
I've got a concrete example of the impact of lack of trust. And this happened years ago. Okay. We had probably 2006 or 7. We'd been working on this big thing. We had a whole bunch of contractors working on it. Now, let's talk a little bit about defense in depth and resiliency. So we had one login that was the developer login that gave you everything but root access to every single, it's one username and password for every single system in the distribution centers. All same username and password for everybody. So it was all shared.
I see.
Right? Yeah, super secure. Somebody made a mistake, and we were pretty sure it was a contractor. And they went and deleted all the history files, so we couldn't see what commands they ran. So we couldn't do any sort of rapid recovery from that mistake.
Yeah.
Because they were afraid of getting caught.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, that cost a bunch of money because it took us forever to figure out what went wrong, how to correct it, and that sort of thing. Of course, it still didn't tighten our security profile. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that just the concept of you're to blame. When we started, this is something I talk about all the time when it comes to continuous integration, that it drives me crazy when there's like some sort of t-shirt you have to wear or a doll that you have to have on your desk because you broke the build. Mm-hmm. We, as an organization, didn't harden the processes enough, and I was allowed to break the build. Yeah. People will make mistakes. What are we doing to throw in the layers of defense to make those mistakes harder to make and less impactful when they happen? And these are the lessons that we should be taking from this: is what are and I'll have to give them a lot of props. You have the whole world asking for a pound of flesh. You've got lawsuits coming in from Delta for $500 million. Yeah. And 4 days later, they post a preliminary postmortem and keep updating it. It's the most transparent I've seen any company with sort of outage before. Imagine Experian having done that. Oh, no, they just fired somebody. Right? And so lots of props. Let's leverage that. And I kept advocating, let's wait for the postmortem. Stop this.
Yeah. I explicitly didn't want to comment until I read the postmortem, and then I had a field day.
Yeah. Now I have some takeaways. I'm reading between the lines a little bit, so I have some things that I think were a mindset problem that we should.
So my initial gut feeling was, I don't trust this company, and this is a subjective, irrational response. Mm-hmm. My gut feeling is I don't trust this company based on how they have chosen to write the response and do the incident report and what they're focusing on in their report. Right? So it is heavily diluted into generic legalese. So they are factually correct, technically correct.
Yeah.
But it's not delivering like the real, like for example, if a hospital had an outage of this and it negatively impacted somebody's well-being, if somebody died, God forbid, I would expect maybe the CTO or somebody who was most responsible, the highest up, to step down and resign if it came to human harm, and to say, we messed this up. I'm the head of the snake, and I'm gonna do the responsible thing.
No, so I think it's important to point out, though, that this is not their final postmortem, right?
This is a preliminary.
Yes.
And so, again, with the blaming and witch hunt, it's really important to point out that, we with the attempted Trump assassination, we had the head of the Secret Service step down. Right. So that is not the same thing as looking for someone to blame. It is taking responsibility. Mm-hmm. And particularly, it is taking responsibility by somebody in a leadership position for the inadequacies of the system, of the culture. Right? So something in our system, in our culture, something in our processes that I ultimately, as the leader, oversee and I'm responsible and accountable for, has led to this. And it is very different than, putting a name on it and somebody resigning on the top is very different than saying this developer deployed. That naming the IC, and God forbid that somebody takes it
That's not a
personally and then
solution
sends
to a
death
problem.
threats.
That is opening a new set of problems for the future. And that's
Which
actually
one?
what happens. So what you said last, to blame a single person,
Yeah,
just as basically hang this
No,
person,
I
right?
actually made this point in a thread that somebody was talking about how we should be prosecuting developers or, holding them, legally
Look,
liable in some way.
It's
And
a publicly traded company. They lost, last time I checked, 30% off of their stock. It's a lot of money. It seems to me they've been held accountable.
Yeah.
My concern is if they are still embedded in core infrastructure in most, it seems, worldwide systems, but mostly the US ones, they were held accountable. Cool. Did they learn anything from this? Like, we saw evidence that this is likely to happen. I liked that in their preliminary report, they said, this incident is unlikely to happen again. Right? So this exact one, right? So this exact case is unlikely to happen. But are they addressing the systemic issue? Are they addressing similar or this
going back to the people who are commenting?
Yeah.
The people who are jumping to solutions. We're also focusing on how to prevent that incident. I'm like, I don't care about that incident.
Because
it happened.
This one is easy, right? Because I have data. I can write a regression test for it, no problem.
Yeah.
Right? But as you said with the bike, right? Because you were reading about the risk of the bike. I don't want to test every single accident scenario with my own skim. Like, I would much rather I systemically reduce the risk factor every time I go on the bike, not to actually test having, let's see how I react to that kind of accident. It's like, no.
Every day I tested it.
I'd like to talk about some of the things that they don't explicitly call out in the postmortem that are some of my takeaways. Okay, and it's mostly a mindset thing.
How would you write this postmortem? Like, what would you focus on?
Well, number one, I'd focus on going and collecting all of the data. Right. So, I mean, I can talk about generally how I go about doing a postmortem. Which is number one, what happened, what was the timeline. Try to dig into what actually occurred without tying it to a person, because it shouldn't. Because we all broke it, no matter who touched it, right? And then come up with a remediation plan. I can't talk about how to improve their postmortem because I wasn't in the room during the interviewing. When we so I feel very uncomfortable criticizing the postmortem process because I don't know what it is. Yeah. Right. But the things that I predicted was that they had so number one, my understanding is this was a critical release of an update because of an active vulnerability out in the wild. Yeah. So this is my understanding. To me, that's a hotfix.
Which is what they are paid for to provide protection from. I said this is their main product to protect very rapidly from these kinds of incidents.
Now, before I knew what kind of change it was, right? My assumption was that they had a different process for hotfixes.
Hotfixing, it turned out not to be the case.
Yeah,
because this was deliberately a different deployment vessel, a deployment artifact than your normal code change.
And the takeaway I have from that is that they didn't consider configuration to be the same as code.
Yeah, that was my takeaway as well. So for context for our listeners, quick executive summary. They have code running in the kernel space that it's very difficult to change. So with the kernel space, they're also deploying, imagine recipes. They're deploying recipes, little snippets of templates, of instructions, of signatures, so that the recipes land next to the code, and it doesn't require the same level of security as updating the kernel code. And it doesn't require rebooting the system, from what I understood.
I mean, and the way that I would, the model I have for this, right, is it's like throwing data on in a database for an application to work on, right?
Sort of, but it wasn't inserted into a database. It was kind of like the database was deployed next to another database, right? So
For
so
me,
the peculiarities are.
I would even say it's more like let's stick with configurations. It is more
Sure.
like something like infrastructure as code, which is not in the versioning system. It is next to it. So you
What's a
can
good
push
metaphor
something.
for this? It's a good metaphor for this.
Yeah.
What is this? What is this? What is this exactly?
But so basically, it's a configuration change. It's telling the system, hey, we want you to operate under slightly different rules. Well, that's code.
Sure.
Right? And any sort of change should always be considered to be a change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Criticality is different, but the methods we use to validate change should be the same.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I say that, but to deploy a new version of the software that's running those rules they have to send it to Microsoft to have it certified.
Yeah.
So you
For
can't
the kernel space.
You can't do that when you're doing a change like this.
A hotfix. It takes too long.
But it appears at least from the postmortem, that the level of testing internally they do is quite a level down.
Yes.
Configuration change and validating how the configuration modifies how the application works versus what they do when they modify the application that's running the configuration. So that's what it appears to me, is that they have there's a mental model. A configuration is not code. It doesn't have to be as rigorously tested.
Mm-hmm.
That was a mindset for many years, I think, in the vast majority of companies. But I think with a newer movement in software development, especially when cloud native came and things like Terraform saw light of the world, then things changed. So it becomes more integrative in software development to say, or with Docker, for example, already. You have a lot of configuration already going on in software development these days, which is part of your code base. So your code base defines how the code will look like in the cloud or something like that.
And I wonder if my personal background is coloring how I view this versus people who don't have the same experience as I have. Because if you start development now, you're probably going to be using Docker. You're going to a place where probably the cloud. Variability between systems is either minimal or non-existent. Yay for you people that don't have my pain. But when I
I know what you mean.
When I was delivering originally, for years, all right. If you think anytime before 2016, okay, about then, anytime I deployed, I was going to 50 odd buildings. Each one of those buildings had 2 app servers and 2 database servers. Those were bare metal Unix boxes. They were not under my control. They were under the control of an infrastructure team that thought version control was only for those software developer people. And so they'd make configuration changes on the fly, and you'd have this massive drift between boxes. The impact to me would be that I would go to a pilot to be successful, go to a second pilot with I'd go to one site, then I go to like 3 sites, then I go to like 20 sites, and all of those would work. And then we go to the rest of the other 30 odd sites, and like 3 of those would explode. Right. And we'd be up all night long. So I don't trust my infrastructure. I don't trust that it worked here, so it'll work there, and everywhere else. I don't trust it at all. Don't care. Been awake too much. Right. But what it feels like is that they trusted those customer machines. I'll say that when they say that they're going to start doing canary deploys, based on what? Because I'm not sure. I'd like to know, what did they do to validate that was actually not going to explode? Or did they just trust the validation machine, the validation process they had in place, that they also said was broken.
So
But well, there
The-
can't be a proper test in place, isn't it? So
There-
the
there are-
configuration
so-
was broken.
So there are
Entirely.
tests in place, but it's not what we would consider like a full test suite that fully, thoroughly checks for all.
But I mean, we were talking about a file full of zeros, if I remember that correctly.
No, it's
How
not
can
that
this-
simple. It's not.
I'm
It's
looking
it's
for-
But how can this pass a test? Just asking that simple phenomenon.
it's not. It's not that simple. Imagine more like the subsystem that crashed has 3 or 4 components.
Hmm.
Just the subsystem.
Yeah.
And it was one of the in-between components in the process chain
Hmm.
that crashed. Imagine, you did PHP, Adrian. Imagine you have Nginx, you have PHP FPM, you have your website. Your website has a database connection, and you reload Nginx's config. You deploy the config to the server, and you reload the config for Nginx. Now, your website will crash because Nginx has crashed, which will make PHP FPM either kill the pool or spawn way too many in the pool because it keeps restarting itself. Right? So that's the nature of the moving parts of what happened. So one of those in-between process pieces crashed. The test was performed on one piece, and the config was deployed to another piece. This was tested, but it was mocked in a way that was reasonable and obviously not tested with this exact data. This data was not tested because it has no behavior, it's just data. And it was assumed that this thing... Yes, and it is
critical
assumed...
environments you need to test that. This is what I mean.
And from what I can see from the link that I just linked, so this is overmind.tech inside Crowdstrike deployment process. I'll link it to... Yes, LinkedIn audience, you're special because my chat doesn't go through for some reason. There we go. There's the link. Here it got highlighted that the code that handled this change was deployed in March, was developed in February, and was tested in March. And in March, it was verified that the content validator, right? So the validator for this config, the loading procedure for this config, the reload behavior, so the hot reload behavior for this config, is all adequate. It's adequate to the standards of the company. It got rolled out gradually, canary release, etc., etc., etc. And it's been in production since March. And July, whatever it was, now, a content piece was deployed that made that thing crash. Right, so there was I don't know whether it was a hole. If I oversimplify and say there was a line that wasn't covered, or there was a branch of code that wasn't covered, but that's overly simplistic. I know working with configs like this, it is an open-ended problem because it is essentially a lexer of its own. It's a compiler of its own. It's very difficult to test all permutations. Or what they could have done is, since they are the authors of both the interpreter and the code, they could have just run the damn thing through the interpreter before rolling it out.
I want to be, this is also something I want to be very careful of because, since living in America since 2016, disinformation has just become the world I have to wade through. And yes, I've heard that the configuration file was all zeros, but I've been Googling.
I've not seen that confirmed by anybody.
I haven't seen
it seems to be a misinterpretation of the kernel panic screen that everybody's reading way too much detail.
So I heard that from somebody who's been releasing videos, and he's an ex-Windows developer, and he's been going through this, right? And so it could be true. I don't know for a fact, but ultimately it doesn't matter. It was a test condition that they didn't allow for, and the Falcon sensor hit that condition, and had a memory out of bounds error and panicked the kernel. And as soon as it did that, then the Windows goes to BSOD. It tries to reboot. Well, to reboot, it's going to load all the kernel drivers.
It's also a privileged. It's also a privileged service, so it'll boot on.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I did not see the need for that. My expectation would have been that if it reboots itself in recovery mode and safe mode, that at least in that state it wouldn't be privileged. But now, since this is a security product, I would assume that anytime if an attacker could use this to force boot into an unsecured environment, that I would immediately void that hardware from the network. So I would assume if CrowdStrike could guarantee that their product always loads, even in a safe mode state or like kind of semi-crash state, so it would not compromise security if it was forced into this state. But I've never thought about what would happen if the software itself compromises itself, right? So naturally, it obviously did not allow the system to load in a compromised state. So it kind of fulfilled, it worked, right?
Yeah,
but the hardware could also not be operated on, recovered, which is I don't mind that it blue screened. Honestly, I don't mind that it blue screened. What I mind is that this is a deployment process that relies on over-the-wire hotfixing for a critical piece of infrastructure. If it blue screens like this, I think at least they should have gone to the same level of detail to make sure that it can be recovered from remotely as well.
Well, let's dig into that, but there's something important that you touched on that I think, because going back to this is a systemic failure. Okay, why was it a kernel driver? Right, it was a kernel driver because in 2009, Microsoft was told they had to open up the kernel to security products by the European Union.
Yeah,
that's why it was a kernel driver. So thank you.
We again.
and why was that? Do you know the context of why that was?
Yeah,
I vaguely have it in my memory, but
because I looked into this. Right?
It was for anti-monopoly laws for antivirus programs, because Windows Defend, like Windows, it's Windows Defender, right? Windows Defender had privileged access to its unobfuscated memory space. I forget what the cryptographic term is for that. The vector space for memory addresses is usually obfuscated so that each process only sees its own memory space without knowing absolutely where things are in memory.
Memory isolation.
Memory isolation, is that what it's called?
I know that with that terminology.
And Windows Defender had unique unobfuscated access to that vendor space, which means that they could lease that capability to their antivirus vendor of choice, which triggered antitrust, anti-monopoly, stuff from the EU.
Microsoft being Microsoft, they get special treatment because of their anti-competitive history, right?
Yeah. And they are quite a frequent offender. Let's not, tit for tat. Like it's, there's a reason these laws are in place.
But this is a case where the government's partially responsible for the incident, and we should acknowledge the government's partially responsible for the incident. Windows is partially responsible for the incident because of the design of their operating system. It's because of their anti-competitive practices, the design of their operating system, and the impact of getting sued, they had to punch a hole into and make their operating system fragile enough for this to happen.
Yeah.
And it's so there's dominoes here we have to think of.
So for context, Linux, the Unix kernel, and the Mac OS, it's also extension of the Unix kernel, but Linux and Mac OS do not allow this kind of access to the memory space.
Right. Yeah.
Like Windows is one of the rare mainstream operating systems that allow this kind of access to third-party vendors. They have to be certified.
Yeah.
They have to be certified. Like there's rules, right? Like it's not for everybody. They have to be certified. But they deliberately had a deployment process where they can deliver, we keep calling it configs, but it's code. It's code, it's structured declarative code, right? So they had a deployment mechanism to deploy something to these machines that did not require certification.
It's the virus rules is what it is. Like if you're running
the virus rules, yeah.
But the question of mine, a stupid question now is, I imagine now there's a developer and there's a Windows machine and they're sitting there and they're testing it, and then they, put it on the machine, they reboot the machine, and was it working for them before they delivered it? So
Yeah,
I asked
and-
myself, so how do they develop that? Because it broke, as far as I know, on every instance. So it should have been broken in the test environment as well.
I mean, it's
And this is
obvious
what
to
I
me that
don't
they didn't
understand.
test it.
hang on. So this is something else. It broke 8.5 million machines,
Yeah.
but it was
Instantly.
but it was out there in the wild for 90 minutes before it was taken offline off their download server.
Yeah.
Did it only get downloaded by 8.5 million machines? I don't know. Did it break all the machines it touched? I don't know. Right? I'm not comfortable saying it broke everything. And oh my God, if only they'd done a thing, it would have fixed it. So I've got this hypothetical I proposed too, because I think there's other things we should think about as consumers of SaaS services. Okay, so number one, Microsoft has had an outage the day before. And sure, it only impacted US Central, but it took things down for like 4 hours.
Yeah.
They had an outage yesterday because I was trying to pull up the postmortem from the outage on the 18th. They had an outage yesterday that was only global and only impacted Office 365. And both of those were configuration changes. Right? So it's not just CrowdStrike that has this problem.
And there were power outages in Texas and similar things on
today
infrastructure.
with my software, so it's I think
so
everyone does.
Brian, a US specific question. Since we touched on regulatory, maybe regulatory overreach from the EU here. Since 9/11 and the war on terror and etc., are infrastructure companies like airport vendors, airport operators, software in hospitals, are they required by law, by regulation, to have something like CrowdStrike on most of their critical systems?
I have no idea. Probably not. I don't know.
Like, would a chief security officer's first thought be all customer-facing machines have to be secured in some way?
I'm sure the CISO is going to think something about it, but I don't think it's a government regulation about it. But I would like to talk about.
No, so my question is specifically because this is infrastructure, right? So medical, airspace. Is there anything of that nature that might not be obvious to Europeans that would require them to, like, was this if what is it? Is it United? Is it the CTO from United who decided to install CrowdStrike, or were they incentivized to install CrowdStrike onto their Windows machines?
Oh, I'm sure that their security team said, "Hey, we need to make sure all our systems are secure." It's not something that comes from the outside. It was something from the outside.
Because that seems like a reasonable conversation to have, right? It's like, hey, our systems are not secure. What's the most reasonable security system?
Sure.
Let's install CrowdStrike.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's a security system, so obviously it'll have kernel access on our key machines. Yes?
But
yes.
Let's run through a hypothetical and talk about some other systemic failures. Okay, so hypothetically, they did a canary deploy. They say that they're going to start doing that. So let's think about the fact that the fact that a defect will instantly take down every machine it ever touches is super, super rare. Okay, and let's think about the broader concept of you're deploying something to a lot of systems. All right, how do I remain safe? And then what's the impact of that? Okay,
yeah.
So let's say they did a canary, and it worked, and they put it on the download server. For a small subset of their customers. Now, they didn't deploy to all their customers. I know that because my wife works for a very large enterprise that uses a lot of Windows, and they had zero impact. Okay. And let's say they did a staged deploy, which is something they talk about they have not done, but they do a staged deploy. Now, how big is, that staged deploy, especially with something like this? Hundreds of thousands of machines? Let's just say hundreds of thousands of machines. A couple of orders of magnitude smaller than the impact. Okay. And it only hits Delta in a hospital. Okay. Delta is still being impacted by that change. Delta took days to recover mostly. What was Delta's plan for something happening to their servers? What was their resiliency plan?
Yeah.
And so you have to look at the entire system. Everything is being impacted by this. What is our plan when things go wrong? I was talking to Michael Bolton, who's big into testing, and we were discussing just fundamentally to me, the testing mindset is what could break.
Yeah.
Having the imagination of what could break and what is our response.
But could anybody on Delta predict that CrowdStrike would blue screen all of their systems at the same time for the same reason?
That's heavy.
Well, they took
without
systems.
ability to recover.
They took all updates to all of their systems at the same time. They didn't have to do that. They could have internally controlled how they.
But my understanding from CrowdStrike's report was that their customers, in this case Delta, did not have control over whether they received the update or not.
No control at all. There's no control over me being connected to that server to download the.
There's always some lever, right? But let's say
and anything's possible.
Yeah.
But wow, right? I mean, if so.
No, because it was in their post-mortem that they said, from now on, we will give them more granular control over which updates they want to receive or not. So I'm assuming it wasn't there. Like, at least the granular control wasn't there. So maybe opting in to, what is this? Rapid response. How do they call it? Rapid response content updates?
Yeah.
Maybe they opted into that by default because it just seemed to be the most reasonable. Like, that's why they installed the software, right? That's why they installed Crowdstrike in the first place in the system, to have rapid response capabilities. So it would obviously that if it asks me, hey, do you want rapid response capabilities, that I would check that box. Now, as an operator, I'm assuming, of course, this is a really expensive piece of software. Of course, it won't blue screen my machine. But now, how do I, as a customer, validate that hypothesis?
Because the software is about this rapid response stuff. The question is, how would Delta recover from something where you basically need to manually fix every machine and know how to? And I think this is the problem. Yeah. So there is no automation in that moment because the system isn't operational anymore. It's simply broken. Yes. It's like the machines are exploding and you need to fix them manually. And
well, they continuously reboot themselves. Like, that's the main issue. They continuously reboot themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, at this point, if this is actually a good idea to have that flaw in the kernel or next to the kernel, that close to that, because this is the heart of the machine. So the very fundamental thing, if this isn't working, nothing is working. This is we had that 20 years ago when there were the viruses like the Chernobyl virus and stuff like that, which was basically deleting BIOS and stuff like that. The ROM was deleted. It was deletable back then, or the little config there was deletable. And those kind of things, it actually happened to me as well. So on some point in time, suddenly your machine stopped working. You can't do anything anymore.
Yeah, and it breaks your ability to turn it back on.
Yeah, and then people removed this capabilities, removed those holes so that this can't happen anymore. And I think to myself that if it is really a good idea to have that kind of capabilities inside Windows, when, for example, Unix systems don't need that. So there is a reason why Unix systems don't need that. So I'm not a specialist but I see numbers in that moment.
Why did it need to be a kernel driver? With the ability to bypass certification for kernel driver software.
Well, I mean, you have to have some way of updating it. So, I mean, here's the thing about security, right? It's the scare. So I always consider.
But if they can update it remotely, they have internet access. Why not deliver the content file over the? Why did it have to be compiled and deployed? That's my right. So. If I can ping, like a webhook, if I trigger a webhook and say, this is a broadcast channel, when I trigger this, you download the update. Now, maybe that's what happened. But
that's what happened.
Is that exactly what happened? So the machine decided to download the content update, and then loading it caused the blue screen loop.
Right.
So the only way this got out into production is if the team responsible or the rapid response team, or at least the people who wrote the content update, did not do this exact cycle, at least locally. Like nobody deployed it into like a simulated environment and said, hey, what happens to a machine if it gets exposed to this content update?
Well, so we know that they went through their content validator.
Yes, which seems to be like a isolated mocking environment that structurally checks the file for issues.
Yeah, and we know
for known issues.
We know that there was missing tests in the content validator, or tests that they will now add to the content validator to talk about for that, right?
There is opportunity to cover more of the code without adding or removing code. Like that's clear from the postmortem.
We don't know for a fact that they didn't deploy to a system running the software and validate the content that way.
We don't know that. I agree.
So this is why I'm not confident to say, well, why didn't they just do that? Because then I'd just be replicating, the manager that comes down the hall and say, why didn't you just? All right. It's like, I need to know the details before I start getting really critical, which is what I'm trying to say. What's the broader lessons that we can learn from this?
But this is the point. What are the lessons that we can learn from it is that we should have something like that in place. This is what I personally mean about that. So I ask myself, how can this happen when something like that would be in place? I'm just transferring that to my own software. So when I develop something in a develop branch or something like that, and I push it to some other branch or something like that, I expect that it's still working. Or when I do trunk-based development, I expect that on my machine it's basically the same outcome in a Docker environment than having that on production. So this is what I make sure, that I don't have differences there.
Yeah, and see that I want to come back to the point of there's things that you cannot be 100% safe. They're just not. And I have some concrete examples from my past. We didn't design our software and our database setup to be resilient to somebody unplugging the rack to plug in a floor polisher. That happened, hard crash in the system, hours to recover. We've had people cut the T1 line with a backhoe. Now, fortunately, failed over to satellite, but then, of course, you've got a really narrow bandwidth now, and deal with all of that. I remember years ago, the team responsible for data centers decided to do a failover test to make sure that we had a total outage, let's say someone dropped a bomb on the East data center, it would fall
chaos testing,
to the North data center in Colorado. So they flipped the switch and everything came down because it didn't fail over. They never tested the failover before, and they tested it live.
Yeah.
And so you can't design systems to be resilient for that. What you can do is design what your recovery plan is when things just go completely sideways. And it's not going to be pretty, right? Because you can't predict all the ways it can go sideways. I've had, working around distribution centers, I've had a forklift explode in the middle of a distribution center, burn down part of the warehouse, and then we have to rapidly recover. How do we bring the inventory up to date so they can start shipping freight again? Right. I mean, there are disasters that happen and you can't test for everything. But what you can do is imagine, how the things that are in my control, how can I prevent it from breaking? How do I respond to those sorts of problems?
I still think that when now from the CTO's perspective, Crowdstrike does or must know about their qualities and circumstances, which means that they know exactly to how many machines they deploy, at least roughly, right? So they know exactly what will happen if something is going wrong. So it is not like, hey, there is some gaming machines are down or something like that. We're really talking about infrastructure. Global important infrastructure was down. It was in the news worldwide.
So that's something else I mentioned on their postmortem that I found surprising. It looks like, and I don't know for sure again, but it looks like from the timeline, they had this file out there for 90 minutes. It was being automatically updated to any system connected according to the original incident report.
Yeah.
Which meant that the way they found out it was breaking is a customer called them.
That was what I missed the most from the postmortem.
So they have a note in there about improving their monitoring and instrumentation of the Falcon sensor. But from the timeline, it appears like the way they found out they had an incident was that someone called them and said, "Our system,
everything's down." Yeah.
This is what I mean by quality. So they know that responsibility they need to take and the accountability they have. So they need to have or should have other measurements in place. So I think, okay, actually this postmortem doesn't really tell anything about that, but it isn't really point out, so what was the overall thing before and what they plan to do now in order to prevent something from happening again. So yes, I understand you can't test everything, but we don't talk about edge cases here. This was not an edge case. This was a total down. This is something different. That shouldn't pass through a system. And I ask myself, how can it actually be? So it is not the developer. This is what the entire system there was actually lacking to meet those qualities. So there must be, even for hotfixes, if there is no big necessity, because we have a big hacker global ongoing attack, where I can understand that you need to be very fast. But this wasn't like that. There was not a Ceph1 incident or something like that. So you had some time to test it and evaluate. And I would even think that there should be several in that, let's say, in that scope of deployment you do, there should be more than just a little bit of testing there. Of course, they don't tell about that, but this is what they don't talk about at all.
That's what I dislike the most about the postmortem. So what I'm missing is they just blamed their testing culture, like the code rollout phase. But nobody's talking.
They talk about the testing and they talk about how they deploy. They hit both those topics.
Yes, how they deploy code and how they deploy the content separately, and then the testing. No, but in their preliminary review about what are they going to do in the future, they say, well, they will focus more on testing. The rapid response content deployment will do in stagger deploys and improve monitoring, give customers greater control, give update details via release notes to make sure customers can have a little bit more information about what's going on, and conduct third-party validation or like security audits, security code reviews. But my point is, we now have evidence that the Crowdstrike software can crash critical infrastructure into an unrecoverable state.
So
why is,
to be clear, it's not just Crowdstrike, it's any kernel driver.
It's any kernel driver, but Crowdstrike specifically, why is nobody talking about a rapid response solution to what should be done the next time this happens? Because everything they're talking about is that, oops, won't happen again. Yes, but now we have evidence of this having happened, and this is still a kernel driver, and this is still a freaking over-the-wire deployed content machine that has to be validated correctly. But if it wasn't, it'll. If I cause that process, if a developer deploys something that causes that process to crash, we will end up in the same series and chains of blue screens in possibly the exact same vendors and businesses. And so, what should they do the next time this is what I'm missing from the preliminary postmortem, and I'm aware it's preliminary. I didn't see any communication from the CTO Elia Zaitsev or from the proactive security CTO Mike Petronacci. I didn't see anybody talk about this can happen. You need to be aware that you're using our software. This is risky stuff. Risk is here without us. Risk is here with us. It's slightly larger. We are also a risk factor. Here is the thing you use to make sure you can recover quickly should this happen again. Like that is what I miss from the postmortem.
Well, so and I think that it'd be very difficult to predict all the other ways that this could happen and how you would have to recover quickly, and also the someone said, why didn't they have a backup plan? I'm like, I bet you $100 they had a backup plan, but when the
Yeah,
system,
they probably, and the backup plan probably booted the software in the same way, and it just crashed the backup plan as well.
When suddenly all the systems become effectively air gapped,
yeah,
there's nothing you can do about it.
It's very difficult. The backup plan might have included, rollbacking if it was on the network, but obviously it's not on the network.
Yeah, so it's I don't know how you come up with a general plan for that other than don't do it to all your boxes at once. But let's go back to the testing. No, they don't want to. You can't effectively keep your system secure with the shifting, the shifting threat that's out there all the time.
Of course,
by sending a configuration file to Microsoft and having it certified the same way you would with a sensor. But what you can do is you can do the same internal testing you do with a sensor with the new configuration file, and be as close to the same exact process for delivering every kind of change you can, minus sending it off to Microsoft for them to go certify it. Microsoft certified it was fine, by the way.
Yeah.
So, they knew how those updates were happening. So this was not, again, this is a broader failure than a developer making a code change and a test breaking. Or not breaking.
And Microsoft did not revoke the certification. So,
no.
Should they have? Is that plausible cause for revoking it and making sure they learn from the lesson? Because this is systemic. It's a systemic problem on a broader, issue.
Version. So if they revoke the certification, it would just mean you'd have to uninstall software everywhere until the next version they certify. They're not certifying the company; they're certifying the version of the sensor.
I'm aware, but I'm saying, if this happens, let's just, put them on blacklist for a week, and then let's see if they learn from the lesson.
Then that's the same with the developer not getting sued, and the Crowdstrike company does have a lot of incentive now to make it right and improve.
Of course.
The next company who would then get the new certification to do the very same thing will probably run into the same problem because they don't know about that in the way Crowdstrike knows about that. And another thing is Microsoft should do something about that to work on the next, 1 or 2 decades to get rid of that fragile kernel stuff and prevent a kernel from exploding when there is an error thing. So in code these days you have, where is something like try catch in this case, right? So don't execute something if it's broken. So
I would have to see the code. I don't know enough about.
No,
I would like to think.
It's not about. It is about.
I would like to think that these are very smart people writing.
No, it's a very old architecture, and that's a big problem. When you host Windows servers, you know exactly what I'm talking about right now. It is a heavy nightmare that you need to. For some software, you need to check boxes in the Windows features, which are 15 years old technology on COM protocols, right? So that's bullshit. Sorry to say that. That is not adequate anymore, just because some companies on this planet still use COM things these days. So
Windows is very much like, when I was working on a warehouse management system that was 20 years old, that started as this small system over here, and then just got layers and layers and layers and layers added to it. The core of Windows is still like NT from the mid '90s, right?
Yeah. So and that's the weird thing. They force people to go from Windows 10 to Windows 11 now, but still everything, let's say, in the direction of kernel and all this kind of stuff, is still old school. And I not mean it's not really old school in a positive sense. It's really legacy stuff. You should get obsolete, or it should be tagged obsolete by now, but it isn't. So it is not really Crowdstrike is, in my opinion, delivering a software for a very faulty foundation, and no one is in this case talking about how to fix the foundation. Microsoft doesn't make a topic out of that. I haven't seen anything substantial there where they even the people from Microsoft, the ex-people who made YouTube videos about that weren't talking about that. One or two were just saying, yeah, maybe we should change there something. But no one is really doing something about that. Of course, it's a huge ecosystem. You can't just change it overnight, but you can do something about that. I can't imagine that it is so impossible to do, right? And
So there's a couple of comments that I think we should talk about. One is Pavel's last comment. He posted like almost an hour ago about stories from the aviation industry. And so this is really the thing, is that as an industry, we can either explain how we're too smart to make these mistakes, or we can internalize the lessons learned and figure out ways to make those lessons get spread across the industry.
Yeah.
I tell people my motorcycle, my main motorcycle, I've got two bikes. One's a 1983. I don't worry about it at all. I do have a 2015 BMW with fly-by-wire throttle. So I don't actually have a throttle cable. I just have a sensor. That worries me. It would worry me more to have a self-driving car, because I know how software in this industry is built. And there's a lot of smart people, but there's a lot of pressure to deliver. When you're under pressure, you don't think about all the what ifs. Okay, so that's straight up. But what we don't do is we don't do enough this conversation about how do we take the lessons learned and put together recommendations and follow them. Right? We need to. We can't just keep putting people's lives at risk. But blame a developer. It's the same as blaming an engineer who developed the gas pedal for this Tesla Cybertruck.
Brian, from the perspective of the continuous delivery or continuous deployment, what would you prioritize as being sort of the most important lesson here? Like, is it a problem that it was? This was marked as a green artifact, deployment artifact, and got rolled out.
Yeah.
So would you? And you can answer. Everything is at fault. I'm aware of that. That said,
sure. Yeah, no,
where do you think?
There are parts. Yes.
Yeah. So where do you think the biggest value is? Not just for CrowdStrike, but for maybe somebody else who's also developing kernel software, like Ring Zero software. What do you think the most important, most impactful piece of the puzzle is? Like, is it because
the failure mode is very unique, but the fact that you can
the failure mode is very unique because it air gaps the system.
Yeah, you can blow up and cause as much damage without doing that. Okay, so let's just all software.
So it was marked green incorrectly.
Yeah.
The content update itself. So actually there are two issues. The software that was licensed and certified, that was marked green. Then the content update 4 months later was also marked green. The software update of the behavior that was licensed, that was certified, that one went through Canary gradual deploy and has been in production since March. The content update that went out, from what I understood as hotfix procedure, or rapid response procedure, essentially, was also marked green. It was deemed safe to deploy, and surprisingly, not all machines were affected. So I don't know why that is. Not all Windows machines in the world that have CrowdStrike installed were affected. I'm not sure why that is.
Go ahead.
And there was software involved still in downloading the presumably safe update, and it ran, and only the next up process in the chain crashed. And then when it crashed, it caused an irrecoverable blue screen.
I'm not sure about that last bit. I haven't seen anything about that. But let me address some of those points. Okay. From a priority point of view, it would be, number one, never trust your tests, especially if they're passing all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. What are you doing? What are you doing to figure out that your tests are broken and you just don't know? But that's the mindset point of view. From the physical point of view, Canary, they're saying they're not doing Canary deploys for the configuration changes. The number one priority and change that I would make is that no, we're not going to go send the configuration change to Microsoft to have them certify it with the sensor, but we will run the same internal tests with the sensor in that new configuration.
The same rigor on our
we
end
do with a new sensor
for each
before we
deploy.
deploy it. And then we would do a Canary deploy of that on our internal live systems to crash ourselves, and then stage the rollout and let the blast radius, and still don't trust our Canary. You don't trust anything. Right, everything. So this is a book I got in college.
You'll have to zoom that in. Hang on. Can you? The Zen of Programming. Okay.
The Zen of Programming. Okay, it's super thin. It's a comedy book with lots and lots of truth. Okay? And one of those is every system has a bug. You cannot develop a bug-free system. All right. Yeah. So just expect a bug will happen. The only question is how do we figure out how to mitigate the fact that bug exists?
Yeah, if nothing else, there are space grade problems where a solar flare can cause a bit flip.
Yeah, well, the OS has a bug. Well, in this case, the OS has a bug, but it's just an intentional bug. But don't trust your tests. Their code. This is something that, by the way, drives me crazy. This whole concept of we're going to send your code to a testing team, as if the testing team is smarter than the development team and is perfect and
they know what to test and what the contingencies are and what makes this code update unique so that they can. That's nonsense.
Yeah.
So,
Callian down here had another quote that I thought was really interesting about
the bootable driver one.
If people really understood how fragile everything our lives depend on is when it comes to the software. I think that they would move to the woods and like. Yeah.
So to give context to Callian's comment, he says, "Is it part of this conversation of the fragility of the configuration loading from the bootable driver?" So this device, the sensor, was a device driver in the kernel, and it was flagged as bootable. Yeah. So it got priority essentially, which I think is the main ingredient which caused.
But it has to do its job, right?
But that's the product. Yes, that's the product. Because otherwise you have to compromise. Hey, now my question is, should the owner of the machine have the option to make it not bootable?
But it can't do its job if it's not bootable, and so you're spending a lot of money for something that doesn't work.
As a recovery scenario, but then they would recover it, and then if it works, then they would never put it back into that state. So that's nonsense. I think the blame here is on Crowdstrike, at least the responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen.
So it's doing everything you can upstream to stress test your tests.
Yeah.
Okay. And then also the concept of, I'm going to send it to all the machines, whether you want me to or not. They're already talking about they're going to fix that, but oh my God, I don't trust any upstream thing ever. I don't trust dependencies to be fully functional. I don't trust data. I've been bitten too many times by late night, being awake because of upstream stuff. I don't trust upstream stuff. And so I need some way to protect myself from upstream stuff while still using it. I'm always looking for ways to do that.
So to paraphrase that middle bit of deploying it differently, the core issue was that they had essentially two release artifacts, if I use CD terminology here, and they were for one system. So one system had two release artifacts, and they were deployed independently, tested independently, and their rigor or the culture for testing was different across both artifacts. And one of them obviously had a much lower standard. But now my question is the core issue that there were two and the standard here was lower? Or was the issue itself that these two were separate? Why wasn't this tested in tandem?
Again, you're talking about configuration versus application, and the configuration changes much more rapidly than the application is.
I'm aware of that, and it's probably controlled by the security team, not by the engineering team, right? So there is an element of organizational topology here.
Well, I don't know.
This
if
is
it's
by
true.
design.
I don't know if it's true that they're controlled separately, but it is. This is why I think about it as data versus like something that you just compile into the.
Fair. Yeah.
It's a data change.
One's software engineering, the other one's data engineering, let's say.
Well, I'm just talking about from what it is physically. It's data, okay, and then it's a big problem, not the core problem. A big problem is that the testing process was different between the two.
Yeah.
Right now, again,
because they are dependent systems, you would assume that either one of them can trigger a full system sweep across both of them, right? Like that would be my assumption, that if they're dependent systems,
the sensor without the data doesn't do anything, right?
Yes, so the sensor without the data has to use mocks to test something, and the data without the sensor has to be mocked on a validator to be able to test it.
Isn't that a little bit unnecessary? So not unnecessary, but this isn't really the point why this wasn't working. So they deployed a configuration, and this configuration needs to be tested against the application parts before it will be released. So it is not the part that the application must be tested against the configuration, but the configuration against the application.
Well, both are true. Both are true. So if we're making a configuration change,
we should test it against the application.
The sensor, we would test it against all of the rules we have deployed, wouldn't we?
Yeah. Now my question is,
of course, but especially for the deploy, it is 100% necessary to test this configuration against the currently used versions on deployed versions of the application. That is absolutely necessary. And the question still is, why wasn't I assume this happens in some way. I can't imagine that they don't do that. It is
but they said that one of their improvements is going to start doing canary deploys
on the content. So they weren't doing that.
They weren't doing that, right? Yeah. And so this is what I'm saying is, so item number one is that they had a different testing process for releasing a change to the driver versus releasing a change to the rules for the driver. And you should have the same testing process for both, because ultimately they are one thing when you go to production.
Yeah.
Now, my only concern here is that maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way, and we're only looking at the area of incidents. But maybe there are millions of content updates, and there are thousands of different versions of Crowdstrike, the kernel, the sensor itself. Maybe there's thousands of different versions of the Falcon driver. Mm-hmm. So maybe this kind of rigorous testing happens nightly or like once a week, just due to sheer volume.
Okay.
And so I'm sort of steel-manning that maybe this process does exist, but the ability to impact the servers into an irrecoverable state was rolled out before this test was finished. And obviously, if the testing takes so long, it's not rapid response anymore, right? So, I wouldn't ignore this idea.
Continuous delivery, isn't it? So
only for the software updates.
Then, at least.
Only for the software updates. They don't do canary and they don't do rolling stage deploys for the content update.
Based off the incident reports, I mean, we can talk about that as a hypothetical. Based off the incident reports of this incident, I don't believe that's the case. Okay.
Which one?
That there's a whole bunch of different versions of the sensor and a whole bunch of different versions of configuration files. The configuration files, as far as I can tell, are additive. So
so there's hundreds of them.
File, right? Okay. So when you have the latest, when you have all of them.
And this piece of software seems to be new, and they seems to be accumulating either from 100 or from 1 since March. So, suffice to say that this is a new piece of functionality, recent in.
I mean, numbers are very subjective.
I mean, so I would dare claim that their CI/CD pipeline is much older than the introduction of this piece of functionality. So the CI/CD pipeline predates such capability in their system.
Is that something you read somewhere? I didn't read that. I may have missed it.
I'm making a call.
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how that works, because pipelines, in all of my experience, a pipeline is part of the application. They evolve together.
I mean, I like to think that way as well, but obviously in this case it isn't. So I'm trying to steelman the argument of, okay, the security team and the engineering team and the team that owns the pipeline are siloed. This was a benevolent, well-intentioned accident.
I don't.
But how?
I'm very uncomfortable speculating.
Yes, and so I'm speculating the best case scenario for them, and I'm trying to figure out.
Wait, what? How is that a good scenario for them? That everything's siloed and they have.
Well, because then they're just incompetent. Because we're discounting the capability that they have privileged access to infrastructure systems, and that this was a deliberate attack.
Well, I'm not sure how that's the best case scenario for them. Is that they're
just incompetent.
Yeah, just.
Let's say it's the least rude or least insinuating.
So fundamentally, this is one of the things I say about platform engineering is that our job.
Because Brian, before we go on a tangent, so the reason I brought this up is that if somebody could take advantage of a vulnerability in CrowdStrike,
mm-hmm.
this capability didn't go away. They just said, we're just going to be more careful in the future, which now means hackers out there now know that CrowdStrike software is an attack vector.
If they can get through if they can get into CrowdStrike to make the supply chain attack.
Yes, but that's not.
It would have to be a supply chain attack.
It would have to be a supply chain attack mixed with social engineering, very likely.
Yeah.
But we've seen worse. And now I'm thinking, from the level of response, it doesn't, it's very legalese, the incident. The preliminary report is very much playing it safe and vague.
They spent billions of dollars and probably killed some people, so I don't blame them for being a little bit legalese. Again, this is why I'm so surprised about the level of information that has come out.
That we do have,
and the amount of time it took, right? Considering the billions of dollars and probable lives it cost, right? Either indirectly, but still, I mean, if you can't get through to 911 or your hospital system crashes, something's gonna, it's a problem, right? So, so I'm not surprised by that. I was surprised to see it at all, honestly. But there, going back to the lessons.
Surprised to see it at all, opposed to it being covered up.
Yeah. I've seen much less severe things just thrown, just swept under the rug. Many, many times, right? I was happy to see something, right? But I think it's much more important for us to take the lessons away and look at our internal processes and say, okay, what can we learn? What could our takeaways be from this? How can we make ourselves safer? Right? I mean, this is the thing I really want to focus on. How do we make ourselves safer? Am I just committing code and deploying to a whole bunch of systems without a canary? Right? Am I committing code, deploying to a whole bunch of systems, and without any sort of filter at all to make sure that it's working on most of those? Are my tests never failing? That could be a problem. Right? Take a look at our internal development processes. And also from a platform engineering point of view, what I was going to say was that the job of platform engineering is to make it harder to make mistakes while making it easier to deliver value. So what can we do from a platform point of view to make incidents harder? And
particularly, it makes it harder to introduce problems because it crashes faster. Right? So the rate and the frequency and latency at which you're receiving the error is isolated and localized to the person writing code, or at least as close as possible to that person. So that
and that's a development team. Something I'm always doing is I'm looking at our pipelines. I'm looking at what failure modes that have either happened or might happen that we're just now thinking of, and how do we harden our pipelines against those failure modes? How do I, to your point, how do I find out rapidly that I've made a mistake? Because the whole concept of, I bet you they have smart people, sure. And we all make mistakes.
but it's about the standard that the process guarantees, not about the smartest person in the room.
Right.
So even if I give them the benefit of the doubt and say they immediately saw the problem,
They didn't, but go ahead.
but let's assume, let's be naive and say they immediately saw the problem. And not only did they see the problem, but they also immediately saw that there is nothing that they can do to affected machines, or at least they quickly saw that it air gaps the machine, it blue screen loops the machines, and there's nothing they can do against it. And they spent some time investigating whether anything is possible. They said, nope, pull it from the server, and then it stops. And then
So I would have.
So why did it take? So my concern is, if I'm a team like that, what is my desired level of like clear-headedness and response time? I would assume if there's an issue, was it not traced back to this deployment immediately? Was there a delay between deployment and incidents, or why would the developer not pull it from the download server immediately?
So the thing we don't know is what was the time between when testing finished and when it landed on to the deploy server.
That's very particular. So testing finished and deployed to the server, and then what?
Well, so it deployed to the server. So if I'm trying to remember if it was EST or Zulu time, but it landed on the server.
Let me pull it up.
Like 4 o'clock in the morning, I think.
Yeah, 4 o'clock in the morning UTC.
Okay.
There was an update. So the update ran 4:09.
And Crowdstrike Crowdstrike is in where are their developers located?
And I'm not sure.
Because
the incidents were logged. So the incidents were logged. Affected systems were crashing between 4:09 and 5:27, which is immediately after the release.
And then they pulled down the update.
They pulled out the update an hour and a half later.
Why are they deploying an update in the middle of the night for the developers? That's what it looks like to me. Is that they just exposed release in the middle of the night for developers. So that's item number 1 instead of like in the middle of the day.
Wait, 4 a.m. UTC. What time is that in? Is Crowdstrike a U.S. company? Is it a European company?
Well, that's my assumption. It's a U.S. company. I could be wrong, but I mean, if they're in India, it's not the middle of the night. But if they're in America, that's like what is that? 11 p.m. 10 p.m. Eastern Central.
HQ is in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, so that's 10 o'clock at night Central Time. If I'm
I don't have my converting UTC thing.
So I'm 6 hours. I'm 6 hours ahead of the UK. So no, hang on. I'm doing my math backwards. I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not that. It's not that. I'm doing my math backwards. I'm an idiot. So,
it looks. But if I give them the benefit of the doubt, it does look like it was deployed within business hours.
Okay. So that's good.
It's
but
basically midnight. It is
Is
midnight Eastern time. Yeah, I just
And-
asked ChatGPT.
So they released it. We don't know how long the time was between people were running tests and it's fresh of mind between and then
it's 11 p.m.
on the release server. Right.
Yeah, it was deployed at 11 p.m. local time in Texas.
11 a.m.
No, p.m. the previous day.
The midnight when it's dark. That one.
That one.
I'm German. I don't know this PM AM thing.
Yeah. So anyway, were people actually? The point that I'm trying to get to is: were people focusing on that update, or were they had they context switched to something else? Okay, so because it looks like they had no way of remotely telling that things were going south in a big hurry.
And that would be my
If people were not focusing on it, then your MTTR gets delayed. Now they had that up there for 90 minutes. Now the one thing you said that really triggered me, because I've run into this before, is I'm going to go and research and find out if this is the cause. No, we just released something and things blew up.
Yeah,
pull it down.
That's the worst thing, because that's what it looked like to me. I can imagine. Oh, they saw the issue, they knew about it immediately, and they thought, I think there's an easy fix. Let's go try the easy fix. And that is the worst. And that is an amateur response that could only happen if they didn't have an incident procedure in
Yeah,
place.
so it was either that, or they
Which
had
is why I'm going down this rabbit hole with you.
It was either that, or it took 90 minutes for the first customer calls for the customers to realize what had happened and called them. One of those things.
But I find it implausible to think that they are deploying something publicly and they have 0 Windows machines wherever they work with their own software installed.
Yeah, that's that they.
I mean, it's hard.
Employees.
I would imagine.
Either they're saying that either they're in the postmortem, either they're saying, "Oh, we're going to do canary deploys," even though they have one, or they don't have one. They say, "Now we're going to do canary deploys."
I know a very small company who is basically testing all the UIs and stuff like this on various Windows machines every day, constantly, because they are afraid of bugs, and at least there are some other systems. It's not only Windows, but they're using how's it called again? This browser stack, right? So they're using that one. So they are pretty much they have basically a huge staging environment, a virtual one, where they test it. And I don't understand why this. So first of all, I understand that a rapid response thing needs to be done not during daytime. It needs to be done when it's necessary. So that's actually one of those things.
That's the product.
But then you need to have some form of observability capabilities or qualities in place, which helps you, like a staging system, when you have the time for a staging process, to make sure that this is viable. So I still can't imagine that it is impossible to catch that bug and then suddenly find out that something is going wrong out there.
So the takeaway then, right, is your continuous delivery is not the problem. Are you doing continuous delivery, right? So if you're doing continuous delivery, then you're going to be deployable, but that means that you have some way of validating you're deployable. Do you trust your validation that you're deployable? If you're doing continuous deploy, that means that you've automatically validated things are deployable 100%, and you've deployed it. Do you trust your method? Do you have sufficient internal testing, pre-deploy testing? Are you testing your tests? What methods do you have for validating your tests? And no, just telling you doing fuzz testing isn't enough, because testing the bounds of unit tests is not good enough for testing your tests.
Agreed. I mean, it will help create more data with shorter feedback loops, but I
say that is because most people think that unit testing is testing. Unit testing is
yes, but only if you're actually dedicated enough to go explore reasonable composition paths, permutations, etc. Especially since the two deployment artifacts, the content and the code that runs it, were developed 4 months apart, as far as we know. But I like where you're going with this regarding. It seemed the egress path of continuous delivery seemed to have performed well here, but they were right. So at least the.
So I gave a talk. My wife and I gave years ago for a remote meetup, and for a backdrop, I used to have a big whiteboard in my office, and I had on the whiteboard it says Jenkins not equals CD, right? So
yeah.
Right. No, so we should really be looking at how we're testing, look at the risk profile of what we're delivering, and make sure that our testing is up to our risk profile.
Because what this tells me,
process as part of that testing, we test in production also.
Yes. So to me, the immediate what jumps out to me is that this was a failure in observability. They didn't know that things went wrong due to their deploy. They didn't connect it back to the immediate deployment artifact. Like, they didn't know that, oops, update ABC123 caused an outage, pull it immediately from the download server.
So again,
CD
not equal Jenkins. Observability is part of your pipeline.
Observability is part of your pipeline. But what I want to get to is that it was the observability part of the pipeline that failed miserably here. And something you said, and number two, something you said is that each deployment has a risk profile. And now I'm concerned because, well, now we know what the actual risk profile is for each commit that's going out of the CrowdStrike engineering team.
Mhm.
and the security team that's handling the content updates for these rapid responses. I don't see anything in the postmortem mitigating the risk profile that the process causes that rolled out this change.
Yeah, it was very rapid. So it feels a little bit like a startup approach, but in a wrong environment. So when yeah, that's actually how I see it.
I mean, so this is the challenge, though, is that also when you're dealing with security software, being able to deliver at the speed of threat. I mean, like if their customers got hacked and they had a change that was waiting to be certified, what's the risk of that? And so it, this is
because
right?
Because Brian, under normal circumstances, if the risk profile is, let's say, low, let's say CrowdStrike assumed that the risk profile of this happening was extremely low or unlikely, would you favor quick deploys with the possibility of rolling back or mitigating, or would you slow down the entire pipeline to thoroughly check?
Well, it's more about the risk profile is that we're releasing a kernel driver, and kernel drivers can crash the system. So
But
what
that
are we
is an
doing?
inherent risk of the product. Like, that's not going down anytime soon.
But again, it depends. That's what I'm saying. It's the risk profile of the product. So like,
Yeah.
If I'm working on something on a Raspberry Pi that's disconnected from the internet, I don't
inherent risk.
I don't need to do security testing.
Yeah.
Nobody can hack me,
Mhm.
right? So I don't need to add security tests because it's not a risk.
Mhm.
Okay, except for like physical access. I've lost
Physical, yeah. I was just about
so if one of the risks is we know that printer drivers can blue screen of death application.
Yes.
So we got a security driver. It's got kernel level access. It could BSOD the system.
We also had the same issue once with the Razer mice. Razer mice had a over-the-wire auto-update feature for the device driver, and they were, in some cases, they were used as attack.
So that's an inherent risk of this kind of application. What are we doing to create tests for that inherent risk?
Yeah. I just need to open the door, but please continue the conversation. I'll be back in 60 seconds.
Yeah, no problem. And so that's what I'm saying is that you need to understand what the failure modes that are possible in your application, and how do we mitigate that, especially when the failure mode is infinite loop of booting. But not everybody has that, and everybody needs to test for that. You need to understand what the failure modes of your application are, and how do we validate that? I've like in some of the websites that I'm now working on, we have a failure mode of div overruns. How can I test for that without having to go and click through all the pages and see if we have any div overruns?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the failure modes that's inherent with building things with CSS, which frightens and confuses me. How do we validate that? I mean, it's just the mindset of it. Will break. We will make mistakes. These modern web pages are complex organisms. They're not simply.
If nothing else, I am writing specific software against the current version of the browser, and it's only a future browser that will break my code. So there's also that aspect of front-end development of, maybe a future browser will break it, and it'll break it. I will only see that it breaks the moment the new browser gets rolled out and the auto updates.
Yeah, but it's always about the point with browsers is that it won't happen that you will have the same form of outage when you work on a high-level browser, where everything is, let's say, very dedicated to a specific machine. You have high observability. You can change things immediately. It is very, very easy to mitigate such a problem, right? That's which most of the development in the web space is. But today we talk about an extreme example of something, as you already mentioned, or we mentioned, that the risk profile is very high, as we saw. It is up to life-threatening in that moment, right? So there must be something in place, and they haven't talked about that. And the learning of that is we as companies need to understand on the strategic level what our qualities are. And that's a little bit the problem. Most people don't know what quality really means. Quality is an absolute definition you do in the beginning, or you adapt over time, and this is a bar you set and you need to reach and you need to meet. And I think what we saw there is simply they either haven't set the right bar for quality in that case, or they had set it but a disconnect because of circumstances, teams, and stuff like that not working towards that quality. And now they need to close the gap.
The one thing I want to get across is if the takeaway is, oh, we don't want to trust CrowdStrike, uninstall it, instead of the takeaway being, how are our engineering practices? Be introspective. Look at your engineering practices. What are we doing to continuously evolve and harden our pipeline?
I can see myself talking to a group of leaders, engineering managers, tech leads, VPs of engineering, and they say, this is an unmitigated risk. We're exposing ourselves to the risk by having continuous delivery. From now on, no more continuous delivery.
Yeah. You have unmitigated risk. You have computers. No more computers. Let me hand you an abacus.
And it seems to me like a heavy-handed approach, but it's not unintuitive to me, and it worries me. It worries me that it's so easy to draw this conclusion of, oh, maybe they shouldn't have done continuous delivery. Now, again, the product is rapid response. Like, this is the product that would want continuous delivery for a kernel driver. So it is the riskiest possible scenario. But now my thinking is, if continuous delivery onto a kernel driver is so difficult to pull off.
But imagine this risk. Let's say that it didn't create a failure mode of air gapping the systems, and they could roll forward and fix it.
That's my only issue, really. If it didn't air gap the system, this would be completely fine.
Yeah. But because continuous delivery is so risky, what we have to do is we have to sit down in a room and come up with the manual process to do that.
I would trust that process less, because I would if it was manual, a human operator could deliberately crash systems. So like I wouldn't even want that kind of. No, what I'm worried about is some kind of change advisory board, like blocking, like red shirting every release.
I've got one story. I know we have to wrap up, but I have one story about that. I have a friend of mine who did a postmortem about an incident for a health and wellness system.
Yeah.
During his investigation, so the company he worked for had reinstituted caps.
For this reason, like for
no, a while back.
Okay.
Because quality standards, instead of improving engineering, we'll add caps. During his investigation, he discovered that the change that would have prevented the incident was stuck in. Now, he was also told to remove that from the postmortem because that would cause, that would ruffle feathers. So when you do your postmortems, when you break things, be honest, learn from it, and help other people learn from it, so we can all make this industry less dangerous. Thanks.
That's a valuable metaphor. It's a valuable story. Yeah. Because maybe they did have the fix ready.
Yeah.
Maybe they did have the rollback, the button there. It just didn't do anything because the machines were air gapped.
Yep.
So from that perspective, I would say, I said earlier, like the egress part of CI/CD seemed to be performing correctly, but it seems nobody anticipated that the system could be forcibly air gapped. But now my concern is, this is not uniquely CrowdStrike related.
No.
If you uninstall CrowdStrike and you install something else, that company has exactly the same problem.
Sure.
This is what I meant, that Microsoft should talk about how they're going to improve the entire system there, that it's fail-safe, that it's actually isolated, that there is, if something is going wrong, that kind of software will be isolated. And
that it doesn't air gap the machine.
Guys, it could have been Microsoft. They could have. What if you had Microsoft security software? They released an update and they bricked it, right? Sure. Again, they have a pretty. Go look at Azure's uptime. That's all I'm saying. Go look at how many outages Azure has every single month.
Fair. Yeah. Hello.
Anyway, I know we have to wrap it up. This is I've enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we'll have more people learning the right lessons than the wrong lessons.
Mhm.
That's all I can hope for.
From a quick bullet round of questions, just to wrap up, is this a good metaphor, a good story, or a bad story for continuous delivery?
I think it's orthogonal to set it to CD. It wouldn't have mattered.
It wouldn't have mattered.
No.
Okay.
Because while CD makes the testing process repeatable, the testing process was
It eliminates the human factor from the procedure.
But the testing process was obviously deficient.
Yeah. So this was human error.
Yeah, they designed their entire system for failure.
Is it possible to design such a system without this inherent risk? I'm not an expert on this, so I sort of naively ask, it might even be the wrong question to ask.
Fix Windows.
Like continuous delivery for a kernel drive. Like, is it possible to mitigate this risk without the assistance of Microsoft?
We can build software so we can fix that problem if there is a will to do so. So yes, 100% sure. So don't treat Windows. It is always like, and this is what I hate about Microsoft so much. They treat their software as some kind of law of physics.
Mm-hmm.
It is so awful, really. It is like they're talking every year in every update. They're talking about removing stuff from the Windows Server stuff, but it's always there. It is always making the same troubles.
And the control panel is still from the 90s.
Yeah.
Guys, would you now be more hesitant to install software that has kernel access?
Dude, I'm hesitant to install any software. What do you mean?
No, but I mean, from now on, would you recommend that companies just don't do security at kernel level? Like, is this just something?
No.
From now on, is this if it's not possible to mitigate this risk, is the correct response? Never mind CrowdStrike, just zero third-party vendor.
No, because if you're running a Windows operating system and you want the level of security that you need, then you have to have something that has kernel level access in the current version of Windows. Right. So your options are eliminate that layer of security, or you
change operating system,
or you have change operating systems, or you have, which is not feasible because all of your software is
of course.
Or you have a kernel driver that's doing this until Microsoft changes architectures, and so
that's not going to happen.
It's really your options, right?
Mm-hmm.
So no, the options are not those. The options are, okay, how do we make sure that if there is another incident, that take down all our machines?
Yeah. Interesting. Great discussion, guys. I am buying a new Mac. I just got the pre-order. So
finally.
I am.
So we don't have the fan anymore.
What fan?
Your Mac fan of the
I've been using Macs for a decade now exclusively, but the reason for that is so that I don't have to remember between backslash and slash. That's
the only thing, since we have still legacy Windows machines in maintenance for another company, and it is so hard to find a good program to actually remote on those machines with a Mac and get the keys right. It is so especially on a German keyboard. I don't know if it is an English one as well. So basically, when you were trying to do an add symbol, you basically close the program. That's so awful. That is so awful. It is basically on Q. So have Control Q is closing the program, and it's the same where the add is on the German keyboard. And if you mix match between those two systems, you constantly close programs. And it's so annoying when you have your 5 remotes open and you close them and you need to reopen them.
The Slovenian keyboard is even worse because it's Alt-GR, so it's the right Alt and B, so that's even worse.
I don't know. I only it's the last time I remoted
On Windows.
Yeah, I don't remote into Windows systems. I have to ask my
But
wife.
they moved it to command option 2 on Mac systems on the Slovenian keyboard. So it's very close to the US setup. Well, this was a very pleasant conversation, gentlemen. Brian, thank you so much for being with us today, taking the time to have I think we really had an in-depth, on-topic conversation about the incident, their continuous delivery practices, about whatever insights we can gain. Any final thoughts, Adrian, Brian?
Adrian?
No, I don't have any thoughts.
No, please.
I don't want to do any more Microsoft bashing now, so I don't start again.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everybody's got dirty laundry. I'm not up to bash anybody. No, I mean, just look at how you're delivering software and make it better. Really,
yeah.
You are not too smart to have prevented that. I'm sorry, it's just not true. Something
because that's my main sort of place of empathy is coming from this place of, yes, testing and canary and everything, but when it comes to just having a CI system over the wire through a kernel software, I don't see what could have been done differently. Like other than not blue screening the damn machines into a dev cycle, right? But now that I'm aware of this problem, other than thoroughly testing that I don't cause the problem, I still don't know what to do when this happens. So this seems to be an inherent problem that we're not getting. It is, the landscape just became more complex. So I have empathy with everybody who's at engineering at Crowdstrike right now, trying to figure out the problem of, okay, was kernel access a mistake? Should we take this a level higher and just get Microsoft to give us memory access without having kernel access? Like, is that possible? When something like this happens, is it possible to not cause a blue screen? Where are we going with this? Like, who is ultimately most accessible and available and actionable to take a response, so that we guarantee not to repeat this mistake in the future? Whoever it is, might be us developing kernel
there's
software.
Absolutely no guarantees.
So overall, Crowdstrike was about how to get basically the total amount of blue screens you have in a month on a day. That's actually what's this about.
Somebody had a KPI for it. There we go.
Oh, I only have one more thought, and then I got to run. No, guys, Rust doesn't make everything safer.
Okay, you heard it here first.
Just stop.
I saw that post. I saw your reply to it. I don't want to open up the topic again. Brian, if you don't mind, if you got that post linked anywhere, drop it in the comments.
No, it's not A1. I've seen lots of them, and not only for this instance, it's always Rust as the answer. No, I know it's your favorite language. This
is a very complex problem.
Yeah.
This is a very complex problem that doesn't get magically solved by having statically typed, provable source code be linted before it gets deployed, and it blue screens an entire football stadium worth of PCs that are running key infrastructure, and we don't know how to recover without physical access. So Rust, I agree with you. It wouldn't have mitigated the risk. It might have eased some problems, but it does not mitigate the risk.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's time to stop. For our live audience, thank you so much for being with us. For our generous chat participants, Kaloyan, Pavel, and whoever I missed, I'm very sorry. It's a bit late now. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you next time. We have some guests lining up again regarding CTO level discussions. We'll have more updates for you next week. Adrian, Brian, thank you so much. Ciao.